I was asked to speak about why Catholics should care about Christian persecution. And maybe the best way to fulfill that invitation is to share how it is that my brothers and sisters and I, who are members of the Trinitarian family, have come to care about those who are persecuted because of their faith in Christ. Before we move forward, for those who I've not had the pleasure to meet before, I will share a little bit about myself and the religious order to which I belong. I'm a Trinitarian priest. I entered the Order of the Most Holy Trinity and of the Captives in August of 1996. I'm originally from the state of Wisconsin, and I now live at our monastery in Pikesville, Maryland, on the northwest side of Baltimore. In addition to my work as treasurer, secretary, and fundraiser for the province, I also have the honor of serving as president of Trinitarian International Solidarity, also called SIT, and I've done that for about 12 years. My involvement with SIT, which exists to serve persecuted Christians, is why I am here today. SIT is a focused response by members of the Trinitarian family, our priests, brothers, sisters, nuns, and laity, to the persecution of Christians in our time. As the order was approaching its 800th anniversary, the members of the Trinitarian family realized that the part of the founding charism of the order, specifically ransoming and caring for persecuted Christians, was no longer being carried out in any significant way. There had been no ransoming missions of Christian captives in over 100 years, and the order had focused its efforts on works of mercy and encouraging devotion to the Most Holy Trinity. However, it was clear that Christians around the world were indeed suffering persecution, not always captivity in the traditional sense or understanding, but they were suffering because of their faith in Jesus Christ. And the order created by God to bring remedy to the situation was not responding to their needs in the way that we should have been. So after many meetings, of course we all love lots of meetings, and lots of discussion, Trinitarian International Solidarity, called SIT. In other languages, the S comes first, the T last, but in English it's better the other way around. But SIT was created and approved in the year of the 800th anniversary of the order, 1998. Since that time, it has grown to include folks from almost every jurisdiction of the order, and the Trinitarian family is involved in a significant way here in the United States. And in fact, if it were not for the Trinitarian family, the efforts of SIT would be extremely limited. But our focus is threefold. First of all, encouraging prayer for persecuted Christians. This is critically important. Without prayer, we can accomplish nothing. For example, we have created prayer booklets for morning and evening prayer, stations of the cross for the persecuted church. We have holy hours and encourage folks simply to pray the prayer for persecuted Christians, which Father shared with you at the beginning of our conference, and which we as Trinitarians pray every day. The second thing we do is share information with people we encounter and with those in business, government, and nonprofit organizations who can help to improve the situation. We do this through media, speaking engagements, preaching, personal visits, just sharing with others. It's interesting how many people have never heard of what's happening, and we can't blame them. We all know folks who are literally running from pillar to post all day long. Their jobs, their families keep them busy. They have very little time to be looking at anything beyond the tasks that they see immediately in front of them. So it's always important to share with folks, especially those who are the busiest, because they probably have the least time to find any further information. We also work on bringing actual relief to those who currently experience persecution and to those whose lives have been disrupted by past persecution. Examples of our current projects: in Aleppo, Syria, we collaborate to bring a Catholic education to 2,000 children and teens. Previously, during their first winter, we also provided, during the time of persecution, we provided food and clothing and other things that were necessary. In India, we have something that's called the Tea Garden Girls, and it's a way of assisting young girls, mostly Christians, who have been following jobs. They've gone out to work in the tea gardens, and they're treated very poorly, and oftentimes because of their Christian faith, they're given no further opportunity. They're held in almost like indentured servitude. And so we find ways to educate them, to help them receive opportunities to participate in the life of their country in a better way. Of course, babies in Syria have been experiencing in past years very high rates of mortality. And so we've provided simple things like formula, diapers, etc., hygiene products to help them. Young people from Northeast India and Bhutan, we are assisting them because Christianity there is not welcome. It is persecuted in many ways, and so we educate young people. We take them out of their situation, train them as catechists, and send them back in. And we provide food aid in various places in Iraq and Syria, etc. Some years ago, we rebuilt a Coptic Catholic church in Luxor, Egypt, after it had been destroyed by the Muslim Brotherhood. We have provided pastoral support on the ground in places like Orissa and in Egypt for Sudanese refugees, medical support for refugees from ISIS, support for the Catholics of Baghdad who were suffering tremendously after ISIS had invaded the country. You may ask why we would be concerned with all these ministries, and to help explain that, it might be a good idea to provide a little overview of our history. The Order of the Most Holy Trinity and of the Captives was founded in the year 1198 to ransom Christians who were being held captive in the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of Europe which had been invaded and occupied. Men, women, and children were being taken from their homelands during raiding missions. The Christian areas of Europe were under frequent attack and were in fact shrinking in size, which eventually led to the response of concerned European leaders, which is called the Crusades. This attempt to protect Christians in the Holy Land also resulted in Christian soldiers being held captive. And so our founder, St. John de Matha, who was a professor at the University of Paris, had a vision at his first Mass of Jesus Christ between two captives, one at his right and the other at his left, and he was liberating them. That vision led St. John de Matha and St. Felix of Valois, who was a hermit in the area, to found the order in the year 1198. Through the centuries, thousands of Christians were redeemed. It would be interesting to have a reunion of all the descendants, but we really have no way of gathering them. But I'm sure the numbers would be probably in the hundreds of thousands, if not millions. There were so many redeemed through the years. Trinitarian priests and brothers across Europe collaborated with lay people to collect funds for the ransoming missions. Then the Trinitarian priests and brothers would set off for the Middle East and North Africa to liberate the captives. They were not permitted to ride horses, so they approached foreign lands on the back of donkeys or on foot or sometimes by water. But why no horses? This was done so that they would not be mistaken for invading horses, who, in their right mind, would mount an attack with soldiers sitting on the back of donkeys. No one would do that. So that's how they traveled. Once they reached the places where the Christians were being held captive, they would ransom them. If funds ran short, the Trinitarian priests and brothers would personally take the place of those who were being held captive until a later mission would hopefully, but not always, be able to free them as well. Many Trinitarians who took the place of others died in captivity, awaiting their own ransom. Thousands were ransomed through the centuries. We have in our monastery in Pikesville, Maryland, a very large print of hundreds of men, women, and children who were ransomed during one ransoming mission in about 1752, I think. And it lists the name, where they were from, along with the price paid for their ransom, their occupation, etc. It's an original list, and it's amazing to look at the number of people who were saved in one mission. From its very foundation, the order also engaged in works of mercy in the local area, caring for the poor, the sick, and those in need of God's healing presence. After redeeming the captives, the Trinitarians would have processions through European cities with those captives. The Trinitarians, as well as the liberated captives, would be wearing the Trinitarian scapular, this part of the habit, which has a white background and a red and blue cross emblazoned on it. And it was thus, as best as we can tell, that the colors red, white, and blue came to be associated with freedom or liberty. This combination of colors later found its way into flags, including our own beautiful American flag. Have you ever heard the song, "The Impossible Dream," to dream the impossible dream? It's from a stage play and movie called The Man of La Mancha, which is based on the book Don Quixote, which was written by the most famous Spanish author of all, kind of like the Spanish Shakespeare. His name is Miguel Cervantes. He wrote it after he was ransomed by the Trinitarians, after being held in captivity for 5 years in Algiers. Today we celebrate September 11th. I don't know if we celebrate it, we remember, I guess is a better way of putting it, September 11th. And this is the second September 11th, really. The first one being in 1683, the Battle of Vienna. And we have heard how Vienna was under attack. It was soon to be overrun by the Ottoman Turks. And undoubtedly the Christian population would be forced to renounce their Christian faith and take on Islam. Thankfully, King Jan Sobieski of Poland managed to gather the troops and the kings and princes of Europe and mount a defense of Vienna. And while he was there, he had a chaplain, Jan Casimir von Denhof. Jan Casimir von Denhof accompanied him, and after the battle came to an end on September 12th, King Sobieski gave to his chaplain, Jan Casimir von Denhof, a letter to take to the Holy Father, telling him of the victory, that indeed Vienna was saved and that Christian Europe was being saved. He sent along the battle standard of the Turks, and the Pope received both, went and celebrated a Mass and Thanksgiving at St. John Lateran, and later named tomorrow, September 12th, as the Holy Name of Mary, as a feast day. Established that feast day on the September 12th specifically because of that victory. Why? Because King Jan Sobieski had placed the troops under the patronage of Our Lady of Częstochowa, and indeed the Blessed Virgin Mary came through despite odds that were astounding. Starting in 1787, Thomas Jefferson, who was the U.S. ambassador to France at the time, met numerous times with the Trinitarians in Paris in an attempt to ransom American sailors who had been taken captive by Barbary pirates. The Trinitarians managed to make sure that the American sailors were receiving decent food and a small allowance for their needs, but were unable to ransom the sailors as the bloody and anti-Catholic French Revolution led to the dissolution of the order in France. We only returned to France in the 1970s after about 180 years. But if you read American history, indeed, you will see that our order played a part. Eventually, in 1911, Italian Trinitarians came to the United States to minister to the growing Italian community here, and the order was established in various places across the country. And about 30 years ago, we established a mission in India from the United States, and we have many seminarians there. And our Trinitarian priests and brothers are especially dedicated to serving persecuted Christians and performing works of mercy. Last September, we began a mission in the Philippines, a country in which attacks on Christians are not infrequent. Our priests serve in the Middle East, undercover, in countries I cannot name, where it is illegal to practice the faith, to celebrate Mass or the sacraments. And these priests literally risk their lives to serve Christ and His church. In the past 3 years, 2 of them were arrested and held at different times because they celebrated the holy sacrifice of the Mass. Thankfully, foreign governments were able to intervene and free them, but those who were hosting the Masses were immediately expelled from the country. They were not allowed to stay. They were working there as visitors, workers from other countries, and they were immediately expelled not allowed to take anything other than what they could carry in their hands with them. Our Trinitarians in India serve Catholics who experience religious persecution in that country. And the situation there is complex for Christians. The radical Hindu party is in charge of the national government and many state governments, and they like to blame Christians for breaking up the caste system, which holds people in virtual slavery in much of the country. This is because Christians tell members of the lowest caste of society that their lives have value and that they have rights. We set up schools and clinics. Christians truly care about those who are unjustly oppressed. The education and training of the members of Indian society's lowest castes allows them to move up in society and to take away, but it also takes away the cheap labor force from those who would prefer to use them as a source of sinfully cheap labor. Those who are unhappy with the poor being educated, told that they have basic human rights and offered the opportunity for advancement, sometimes instigate attacks on Christians, their homes, churches, schools, and their farms. When these attacks happen, Christians find themselves facing huge, violent mobs. The desecration of the Blessed Sacrament is often one of their first aims, as they know how this will deeply offend Catholics. A few years ago, while I was in India visiting our monasteries, I met two brothers, Peter and Sebastian, who were from the state of Orissa. They told me a story which I will never forget. They were helping other young men set up the nativity scene on the grounds of their parish church on Christmas Eve, early in the afternoon. Suddenly, people came running to the grounds of the church, telling them that something bad was going to happen to Christians. They knew that often such chatter preceded actual attacks. They quickly ran home to inform their families, and the family fled into the jungle. Other young men refused to leave their nativity scene and the church, and they were badly beaten by the mob. The series of attacks that were organized in their region that Christmas Eve left more than 60,000 people living in the jungle for months. The government either could not or would not protect them if they returned to their own devastated homes, churches, schools, farms, businesses. And the Trinitarians went into the jungle and served the Christians who were living there for months. Eventually, after international pressure was put on India's national government, folks were able to return to their devastated homes, churches, and businesses. But there was little hope for the young people to continue their education. Why? When the Catholic schools were destroyed, when the Christian schools were destroyed, so were the records. Local officials prevented students from those schools from enrolling in government schools because they had no records. So our priests and brothers, and along with our sisters who are living in India, brought groups of young men and women to the monastery and to their convent, found housing for the young women with the sisters, and then collaborated with religious orders running schools to help them finish their education and learn a vocation so that they could support their families. We also gave them training in catechetics so that when they would go back, they would be able to help keep the faith alive in their troubled region. Truly following Jesus requires sacrifice, sometimes more than we can imagine, even more than we might be willing to give if we knew in advance. We know that our forebears made great sacrifices to preserve and pass on the faith. Look at the lives of the apostles, the great missionaries, and the other saints. Look also at the lives of your own forebears. They took great risks to make sure that the faith was guiding them and future generations. I've heard of many stories around the country of churches built 100 or more years ago using loans which were backed by the homes of the parishioners as collateral in case the parish was economically insolvent. Those folks trusted that God would not allow them to perish even if times got tough. I know that persecuted Christians often give their lives rather than turn their backs on Jesus. They repeatedly state their faith when asked and live it as publicly as possible. Religious persecution, of course, takes many forms and has many causes. And it can be difficult for those of us raised in an environment of religious tolerance to understand why other peoples and religions do not value that tolerance as we do. Similarly, it can be difficult for us to recognize that governments can be hostile towards certain religions or to all religion. While we live in a democratic republic, much of our understanding of the relationship between governments and church is rooted in the relationships that existed and in some cases still exist between European monarchies and the church. The last few years marked the 100th anniversary of the abdication of a number of European emperors, kings, princes, dukes, etc. And 2017 was the 100th anniversary of the bloody revolt in Russia. 100 years is not a long time, and the impact of these major changes in governance and the relationship between church and state is still being felt and understood. During that same century, the Christian community has experienced changes at an ever-increasing rate. Many relationships are different than they once were. But because the United States has its political roots in Europe, there has always been a place for religion in our culture. If we took a little drive over to Washington, D.C. to visit large government buildings, we would see that God is honored in inscriptions and artwork in many of those buildings. Rejection of religion in the public square in the West is largely due to the philosophy which fueled the so-called French Revolution, and later by the influence of Karl Marx, his followers, and communist governments. While the degree of hostility toward religion varies, it continues to exist. The people of the former Soviet Union, China, North Korea, and Vietnam have all borne the pain of governments inspired by a godless philosophy. The influence of this philosophy has spread to parts of Latin America, and we clearly see this in Cuba and more recently in Venezuela and other countries which suffer under communist social regimes. In the late 1950s, my Trinitarian brothers and priests were forced to abandon their schools and monasteries in Cuba because of the communist regime. While some churches remained open, the practice of religion is restricted and belief is mocked. A few years ago, a man told me how the young people were indoctrinated in Cuba. This is a story he told from his childhood. He said that the children were sitting in the classroom and they were told to ask God for candy. So they did. God, give us candy. Nothing. They were told, ask Jesus for candy. Jesus, give us candy. They were told to ask the Blessed Virgin Mary for candy. They did. Nothing happened. They were told to ask Castro for candy, and suddenly it came pouring from the vents in the ceiling upon them. A way of indoctrinating young people. Of course, we know that these regimes often use class warfare, confiscation of private property, control of the education of the young, and discrimination against believers to advance their cause. A cause which often promises material goods and equality, but invariably ends in bankruptcy and imprisonment of any who dare to dissent. Around the world, the church remains a place of hope, a voice for the voiceless, and an advocate for the basic human rights of all people, for families, for truth, for a future. However, because the church dares to challenge evil when it sees it, and because the church has influence in the lives of millions of people, those regimes seeking total control of their populace try to discredit, silence, restrict, and suppress the church. We see this generation after generation. It is important that we stand with Christians in countries in which the church is under attack, so our brothers and sisters in Christ know they are not alone. The situation in the Middle East, Africa, and parts of Asia is largely linked to certain strains of Islam. It's clear that those who desire to control land, population, and wealth have linked up with those folks and have overtaken large areas. ISIS-linked groups continue to terrorize parts of Africa. Nigeria, Somalia, and other countries have suffered greatly. In the Philippines, a large city, and I mean a large city, Marawi, was overtaken for months by an ISIS-linked group. Christians were attacked, churches, religious schools, hospitals, and convents were destroyed. In January of 2019, when I had the honor of meeting with the Cardinal of Manila and the Archbishop of Cebu and the Bishop of Paranaque at different times in the Philippines, each of them expressed independently. I didn't meet them together, I met them in different places. Each of them expressed independently their concern for the rise in attacks on the Christian faithful in their land. The trend is worrisome to them. 2 years ago, I spoke at length with an Ethiopian Orthodox priest and a few of his followers who informed me that in their homeland, the communist and Islamic groups were joining forces to push Christianity out. For me and for O.SS.T, the persecution of Christians is our focus, not because we don't care about others who are persecuted because of other faiths, but because we cannot even begin to fully address adequately the suffering of our brothers and sisters in the faith. If we don't care, who will? Clearly, the issue of religious persecution of Christians is a growing concern in our time. You would not have taken the time to be here. This conference would not have been organized if it was unimportant to us and to others. While there are notable exceptions, the average person in the United States, Canada, Europe, and probably other parts of the world hears very little about the persecution of Christians. In societies which have embraced a worldview which puts them on a trajectory of ever-increasing secularism, conversations about religious persecution, especially the persecution of Christians, are often avoided. Of course, people of all religions and those who have no faith at all suffer persecution. Many are in fact persecuted by the very same people and groups that persecute Christians. We cannot underestimate the importance of protecting religious freedom for all. However, we must begin somewhere. As a member of a religious order founded for the redemption of captives, it seems fitting that my efforts be directed towards helping Christians first. Once we make a dent in that enormous task, it may be that God is calling us to expand our scope. Much of what I have mentioned addresses religious persecution around the world, but I would be remiss if I did not mention the state of religious freedom here in the U.S. as well. In recent years, secularism has increased in our society. At the same time, we've seen an increase in government interference in the free practice of religion. Not too many years ago, I was at Catholic University for a conference on religious freedom, and one of the speakers who had been invited from the president, the office of the president who served at the time, emphasized freedom to worship. Freedom to practice was not mentioned. We need to always be careful that we have the freedom to not only worship, but to practice our faith. It is that mentality of freedom to worship and not freedom to practice that has sent the Little Sisters of the Poor to the Supreme Court how many times? And we know that florists, bakers, operators of wedding venues have seen attempts to force them to act in a manner which is contrary to their conscience, healthcare workers, etc. We need to be vigilant. The greatest threat to faith in the United States is apathy. And so we must strive to build strong Christian families, practice our Christian faith in all aspects of our lives. What does each of us do with that great gift of faith that we have been given? Hopefully we nurture it, care for it, and then pass it on, making sure that it's strong and available to those who are coming after it, because trust me, Christianity is the last bastion of human dignity and freedom in the world. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.